Kurt Cobain wrote one of the most famous choruses in rock history, and half the time, he didn't even know what his own lyrics meant. To be fair, what they meant likely meant very little to him. The words to "Smells Like Teen Spirit" weren't finished when the tape started rolling. The melody came first, the lyrics, scribbled on napkins, torn from notebooks, rearranged between takes like a man cutting up a ransom note. This is how Kurt Cobain actually wrote songs, and why almost nobody could do it the way he did. There's a photograph from the early 90s, Kurt Cobain sitting on the floor, guitar across his lap, surrounded by scattered papers. No studio, no grand setup, just a guy with a $1 notebook and a melody he couldn't get out of his head. That image might be the most honest portrait of genius in rock history, because the songs that rewrote the rules came from chaos, before there were arena tours, before magazine covers, before Nirvana became the reluctant voice of an entire generation. Kurt was collecting words, not writing songs. Collecting, like a man stuffing his pockets with things he might need later. He carried cheap spiral notebooks everywhere, the kind you'd buy for $1 at a grocery store checkout, and he filled them constantly. Phrases overheard in diners, dark jokes nobody laughed at, lines ripped from poems, words that sounded violent when you said them fast. Sometimes entire pages of drawings, distorted faces, surreal characters, things that looked like they crawled out of a fever dream. Friends in Olympia and Seattle all described the same habit. He was always scribbling, always, in the backseat of a van that reeked of fast food wrappers and old guitar strings, on kitchen tables, on the floor of whatever rehearsal space would have them. And here's what made it different from any other songwriter's notebook. Kurt never sat down intending to write a complete song. That wasn't how his brain worked. What he built instead was a pile of raw material, fragments, shrapnel, loose ammunition, waiting to be loaded into something. The words came second, always. First came the guitar. Kurt would sit for hours, sometimes an entire afternoon, with one of his beat-up offset Fenders, a Mustang, a Jaguar, nothing expensive, nothing precious. And he'd play the same chord progression over and over and over until his fingers knew it better than his brain did. Dave Grohl once described watching this happen. Just Kurt, alone with a guitar, looping 3 or 4 chords for an hour straight while humming, not singing words, humming nonsense syllables into the air, waiting for a melody to show up uninvited. And those nonsense syllables? They stuck around longer than anyone expected. Kurt admitted in interviews, half joking, half confessing, that sometimes he didn't know what the words meant until after the song was already finished. Sometimes not even then. That's not how you're supposed to write songs. You're supposed to have something to say first, a message, a story. Kurt started with a feeling trapped inside a chord progression and then went hunting through his notebooks for words that matched the vibration. And that hunting process? It's where things got wild. Here's the thing nobody talks about. That method, the notebooks, the humming, the fragments, it worked beautifully in a rehearsal room in Olympia. When you're a broke punk band with no expectations, you can afford to be messy. You can afford to walk into a session with half-finished lyrics and figure it out on the fly. But what happens when your record label is waiting for the follow-up to Nevermind, the album that just knocked Michael Jackson off the top of the charts? In 1991, Nirvana walked into Sound City Studios in Van Nuys, California, with producer Butch Vig. And Butch noticed something immediately. Kurt had notebooks, plural, filled with fragments, but complete lyrics? For the songs they were about to record for what would become one of the best-selling albums of the decade, those were still being written. Vig later said Kurt would flip through those notebooks between takes, scanning pages of scrawled phrases, looking for lines that matched the emotional temperature of whatever they'd just played. He wasn't polishing, he was assembling, right there, in a studio that was costing real money, on a record that was supposed to change the music industry. And somehow, that's exactly what it did. Take Smells Like Teen Spirit. That riff existed long before the words did. The band had been hammering it during rehearsals. Just the chord progression and a vocal shape, a melody without language. When they finally tracked it at Sound City, Kurt was still adjusting the lyrics between takes. singing different variations, testing words against the rhythm like someone trying keys in a lock. By the time the final version was recorded, the lyrics had been shaped by the melody itself, not the other way around. The words were chosen because they felt right in the mouth at that tempo, at that volume, over that distortion. Meaning was secondary to sensation. And that single creative decision, putting sound before sense, produced the song that defined a generation. But Teen Spirit was just the beginning, because when Kurt used that same method on the rest of Nevermind, each song revealed something different about what happens when you let chaos lead. Lithium might be the best example of Kurt's method under pressure. The band had rehearsed the song dozens of times. It had a structure. It had a mood, that eerie, quiet, loud swing that Kurt had absorbed from the Pixies. Soft verse, explosive chorus, the kind of dynamic shift that makes your chest tighten right before the volume doubles. But even after all those rehearsals, Kurt was still changing the words in the studio. Butch Vig watched him step away from the microphone mid-session, walk over to his notebook, cross something out, write something new, and walk back to the mic like nothing happened. The melody never moved. The words orbited around it, shifting until they locked into place. By the time the final vocal was tracked, Lithium had been rewritten in real time, not in some dramatic creative crisis, but in tiny quiet adjustments made between takes, like a painter touching up a canvas that was already hanging on the wall. Personally, I am thankful for this. Lithium, in my humble opinion, is the best Nirvana song. You can disagree if you want, but you'd be wrong. Aneurysm is a close second. Come As You Are started as a warm-up. Kurt had been playing that main riff at home during rehearsals, almost absent-mindedly, the way you'd hum a song stuck in your head without realizing you're doing it. It wasn't being treated as a song, it was just something his fingers did when he picked up a guitar. Chris Novoselic noticed it first. Then Dave Grohl locked into a beat behind it, and suddenly the skeleton of a song appeared. Not because anyone planned it, but because a warm-up exercise had its own gravity. Once the music had form, Kurt went back to the notebooks, flipped pages, found words that matched the liquid, hypnotic feel of that riff, and assembled another song from the pile. The same riff he'd been playing for months without thinking twice almost never became a track. The most recognizable guitar line of 1992 was nearly background noise. None of this happened in a vacuum. Kurt had a blueprint, and he was honest about it. The Pixies, specifically their quiet, loud dynamic, where a whispered verse detonates into a screaming chorus, left a crater in the way Kurt structured songs. He said so openly, no pretense, no claim of pure originality. He heard the Pixies and thought, that's the architecture. Now what do I build inside it? When he started writing material for Nevermind, he chased that contrast obsessively, gentle progression for the verse, then crash, distortion, volume, a chorus that felt like being shoved off a ledge, and once that dynamic existed, he'd go hunting through the notebooks again, looking for words that could survive the shift, lines that worked, whispered, and screamed. That constraint, finding lyrics that functioned at two completely different emotional volumes, forced a kind of writing that was unlike anything else in rock. It's why Nirvana lyrics feel carved from something harder than language. Kurt carried a portable tape recorder during his heaviest writing periods. Nothing fancy, just a cheap handheld machine, the kind every musician had in the early 90s. If a melody arrived at 3 in the morning or in the back of a tour van, he'd hit record and capture himself playing it raw, voice barely above a whisper, guitar barely in tune. Several early Nirvana demos are exactly this, rough sketches, Kurt playing softly while testing out vocal lines that hadn't found their words yet. They sound like secrets, like you're hearing something you weren't supposed to hear. And then there were the rehearsals themselves, where songs sometimes materialized out of thin air. Chris Novoselic described it happening again and again. Kurt would walk into practice, pick up his guitar, and start playing a new riff while the band warmed up, casually, like it was nothing. Dave Grohl would hear it, lock into a beat. Chris would find a bass line. and within minutes, a song existed that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. No announcement, no, "Hey, I wrote something new." Just a riff played during warm-up that turned into a skeleton, that turned into a song, that turned into something millions of people would eventually memorize. That's the part that's hard to teach. The fragments, the notebooks, the quiet, loud structure, those are methods. You can study them. But the instinct to know when 3 chords and a hum are actually a song, that was Kurt. And even when the entire world changed around him, that instinct never did. After Nevermind detonated and turned Nirvana into the most talked about band on the planet, you'd expect the process to evolve. Better studios, bigger budgets, a more professional approach to writing. It didn't happen. Kurt still wrote on floors, hotel rooms, backstage corners, quiet pockets of chaos in a life that had become anything but quiet. He still used the same dollar store notebooks, still hummed before he wrote, still treated every lyric like a piece of a puzzle that didn't need to be solved, just felt. Another fact I find interesting is how Kurt, even when he had money, still lived like he didn't or like it wouldn't last. He had a 1963 Plymouth Valiant. He lived in this car for a time, even after Nevermind was released. He kept it after Nirvana took over the music scene. Then sometime in 1993, he bought a 1986 Volvo. He chose that car for its reputation for safety. He also did, in fact, buy a Lexus, but returned it shortly after because that clearly wasn't his style. By the time Nirvana entered the studio for In Utero in 1993 with producer Steve Albini, Kurt had decades worth of fragments stockpiled. But he still approached new material exactly the same way. Start with a riff, hum melodies until something sticks, pull words from the pile, adjust lines until the vocal rhythm feels natural against the guitar. Albini noticed something else. Kurt recorded vocals fast. Once the melody felt right, he didn't spend hours chasing perfection. He chased the feeling, 1 or 2 takes, while the emotional temperature was still hot, before self-consciousness could creep in and sand down the edges. That urgency is all over In Utero. You can hear it. The vocals sound like they're arriving for the first time, because in a way, they were. Kurt trusted the first instinct more than the polished revision. He knew that the raw take carried something the clean take killed. If you look at Kurt's notebooks today, the real pages, the actual handwriting, they look like chaos. Lists of disconnected phrases, fragments of poems that don't go anywhere, lines written in what was once in one song, ended up in a different song on the record, sketches of things that might be human and might not, arrows connecting words that seem to have no relationship, pages that look like the inside of someone's head during a dream they can't quite remember. And inside that chaos are the building blocks of songs that rewrote rock music. There's something unsettling about that. We want genius to look like genius, controlled, intentional, aware of its own greatness. Kurt's process was the opposite. It was a man sitting on the floor with a guitar, humming syllables that meant nothing, flipping through a mess of pages hoping the right phrase would jump out. No grand plan, no complicated theory, no moment where he sat back and said, "This will change everything." Just fragments gathered from ordinary life, a phrase heard in a diner, a riff played during warm-up, a melody hummed into a cheap tape recorder before it could disappear, assembled into songs that millions of people would carry inside them for the rest of their lives. The voice of a generation was improvising, and maybe that's exactly why it felt so real. If you want to go deeper into the stories behind the music, the habits, the strange rituals, the moments that turned ordinary ideas into legendary songs, subscribe to Beyond the Riff. We dig into rock history the way nobody else does. I'll see you in the next one.